Hey, hello everyone. Hold on, we're just figuring this out here.
Hi, Derek.
Hey, Diana, nice to see you.
I can't
I
see
guess I'll see
you.
you in a second. Yeah.
Hey, Derek.
Hey. Oh, yeah, maybe now we can do it. It's saying you cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. Um,
Hmm. Weird. Let me see. Can you try now, Derek?
we're starting to get we're starting to get a good crowd here. Hello, welcome everyone to this very special event. We're really excited to be hosting this discussion about the life and legacy of National Action Research on the Military Industrial Complex, or NARMIC. And we have two former NARMIC members, NARMIC researchers here who I will introduce in just a second. My name is Derek Seidman. I'm facilitating this event today. I'm a contributing writer for LittleSis, who is hosting this event. LittleSis is an organization that focuses on researching the corporate power structure, both doing the research as an organization, but also helping others to do it, especially organizers and activists through things like trainings, research guides, and through providing tools like the LittleSis database or the Oligrapher mapping tool that anyone can use for free to research powerful individuals and interests and map out power networks. And this event today is part of an ongoing monthly series of public webinars that LittleSis has been hosting, both on how to do power research and also, like today, on the history of power research in supporting movements. If you'd like to get plugged in and hear about the upcoming events, you can sign up for the LittleSis's newsletter and also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. I think Allie's going to dump some links in the chat. I think maybe you can find the newsletter link to Allie if people want to sign on to that. But yeah, we're really excited for this event today. NARMIC is a huge inspiration for LittleSis. And when we scheduled this event months ago, we had no idea that it would occur during such a time of horrific escalation of war, with everything that we're seeing right now in the bombardment of Gaza. And as militarism and war drums grow louder as we speak, we feel a greater sense of urgency around this, and we feel really honored to host an event about NARMIC, where we can learn more about how they use research to resist the corporate forces of war and annihilation. Um, as you'll learn, NARMIC started in the late 1960s and it existed into the 1980s. It was an organization of researchers, but researchers who were plugged into and supporting organizing efforts against war and militarism. NARMIC was started by people who were involved with the anti-war Quaker group, the American Friends Service Committee. It quickly grew into a role, into having an important role within the Vietnam anti-war movement, of providing crucial research support for resistance to the Vietnam War the anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam. And it had a library of resources. It put out reports and tools and that organizers all around the U.S. used. And in addition to doing research around the Vietnam War, it supported resistance to militarism generally, nuclear weapons, South African apartheid, and more. And I think, maybe most of all, NARMIC really played a real crucial role in shining a light, broadly on the corporate forces behind war and militarism. So you'll learn all about NARMIC today. It's still an organization that might not be widely known among the new generation of researchers and organizers, but we're hoping that events like this will pass on the knowledge and awareness of their history and legacy. We have two fantastic panelists today. We have Diana Roose, who is a longtime Quaker activist for peace and justice. She worked for many years at the American Friends Service Committee and is a researcher with NARMIC. Among other things throughout her career, she served as research director for 9 to 5, the National Association of Working Women, and also served as research director of the Sane Education Fund of Philadelphia, where she developed a 12-part radio documentary series, Shadows of the Nuclear Age, that was funded by the National Endowment of Humanities, about the effects of nuclear weapons upon American culture. And there's a lot more to say about Diana Roose. We've actually done an interview with her before that maybe Ali can dump into the chat. Yeah, please check out that interview with her. We're really grateful to have Diana here. And then we have Arthur Kanegis. He is the future president of Future Wave, a nonprofit organization dedicated to shifting our culture of violence to a culture of peace. He's involved. I was looking at his biography before this, and there's too much to summarize. But he's been involved in making really influential films, directing, producing, screenwriting, all of the above, including about nuclear issues. You should Google him, and his bio will come up, and you'll see all the amazing things that he's done. He started his career with the American Friends Service Committee, where he co-produced the Automated Air War, which we mention in one of our profiles of NARMIC, and other materials that were used within the anti-war movement. He's been a radio host, a journalist. Oh, it sounds like looks like he's showing the Automated Air War right now.
This is just the script of the Automated Air War documentary. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, we're excited to hear about it. But yeah, so Diana and Arthur, we're really honored to have both of you here. Thanks so much for your generosity in joining us. Can't tell you how excited we are for this event. We will proceed now with a discussion, and then we'll have some time a little before 1 for questions and answers if anybody has them. And we will, so have some time for that at the end. But for now, I'll pass it on to maybe you first, Arthur. Maybe to start, can you talk a little bit about how did NARMIC come to be, and how did you find NARMIC early on?
Okay. Well, first of all, I had been involved in Quakers since I was born, attending Florida Avenue meeting in Washington D.C. and went on to Earlham College, a Quaker college, and there Stuart Meacham and Honey Knopp, who worked at the American Friends Service Committee, kind of discovered me because I had been organizing a project against Avco, which was making flechettes in these BLU bomblets that are used in the Vietnam War. And one of the corporate executives, one of the board members, came through Avco on a tour, and when he saw the demonstration of these flechettes tearing into a dummy, and these flechettes are like little needles that come in this little ball, and they tear into the flesh, spinning and spinning, and then rip all through the body. Like they can go into one part and then go long distances in the body. Anyway, this board member threw up right on the spot. I mean, it just made him nauseous to see what his own company was doing. So we organized protests against Avco. We did the research about what they were doing and protested that. So Stuart Meacham and Honey Knopp discovered me and invited me to come along. And I invited Marilyn McNabb, who also went to Earlham College, a Quaker college, and had roots in that as well. And she's one of the most fabulous researchers. That was kind of a backbone of the NARMIC program as well. And so that's where we got started. And we started as a collective. The whole idea was not to be top down. Decisions were always made as a group, and it actually worked very well. I can tell you more about how the collective worked but I don't want to. I'll wait for your next question.
Well, maybe we could hear from Diana too about how your thoughts on the start of NARMIC and how you found it, and then we can move on to that. That would be great.
Well, I was a student at Swarthmore College, which was a Quaker college, but I wasn't a Quaker at the time. But after I graduated, I was doing draft counseling in Philadelphia. And as soon as that job ended, it was just a one-year job. I was looking around for something else to do. And one of my fellow draft counselors says, well, why don't you go over to the American Friends Service Committee? They just started this little group called NARMIC, and it works against the war. And I didn't know much about it, but I went over there and I met Arthur and I met Marilyn, and we decided quickly that I would become part of the collective. This was after they had been going for a while. Arthur had already done some of his work on chemical and biological weapons, but I joined the group, and the first job I had was to come up with the list of top 10 defense contractors for the early year. This was never published anywhere else, as far as we know, but it was, the information was available. So we just put this out as a list of companies that were profiting from the war in Vietnam. So that was my start with NARMIC, and I stayed around a long time because I really enjoyed what we were doing.
And maybe a follow-up question for both of you is, so as you're getting involved in NARMIC and it's really getting going, how are you envisioning the role of NARMIC? Like, what's NARMIC's purpose? What's its role within the larger movement in the late 1960s and going into the 1970s?
Well, that's really an excellent question, because what we saw ourselves was as a kind of a bridge that brought together research with action. That's why it's National Action Research, and on the military-industrial complex. And so what we did is we had part of our staff were fantastic researchers. Some people like Eric Prokosh, for example, was just very good with details and pulling all this stuff together, but not necessarily on the presentation side. On the other side, we had people like David Goodman and myself, who went on to be filmmakers as well. I was kind of in between the research and the filmmaking kind of side. But the whole idea was then to take this information and make it available to lots of people in a tangible way that they could use it to build a movement. It wasn't just research for research purposes. So what we did is we helped feed information into groups first with things like that automated air war slideshow. It was actually a full documentary, but it was a documentary done before they had home video. So we had it on slide tape with tapes, or we had a text so people could speak it and give speeches. There we are, the automated air war. And so many people learned to become speakers, and we sold 1,500 of these documentaries to people in the movement who would show it on the sides of buildings and show it on the train going to Washington, D.C., with captive audiences, and they would show it all over to their organizations. It became a real organizing tool. And what it did is it took details that we'd found in all the hearings and so on, and made it into a smooth story that people could understand. And it concludes, because we had staff in Quang Ngai building artificial arms and legs, we would take a little kid whose leg was blown off, and we would show that it was blown off by what the Vietnamese called a leaf mine. Kids would jump up and grab these little fluttering down green little leaves that come down from the sky. The military called them the M41 gravel mine. And when they grabbed them, they would blow up their hand or their leg or whatever. And we discovered the purpose. We looked for it was area denial. That if you killed somebody, you just took one person out of action. If you could maim a kid, you took like 8, 10 people out of action. They all had to have hospitals, and they had to do other things and so on. So this was drying up the swamp in which the Viet Cong swam, was the theory that the military used. So we took their own words and their own quotes and their own thing and put it together with the impact of what it was actually doing. And in the end, we have a powerful slide of that, and the slogan where the kid's leg is blown off, "You can be sure if it's Westinghouse."
Diana, do you when you're thinking about sort of like the role that NARMIC had in the wider movement, what thoughts come to mind, and are there any sort of particular examples that come to mind for you as well about that?
Well, I would say that we were all involved in the anti-war movement, but as NARMIC members, our job was to really help all the other groups that didn't have access to the kind of information we had. We had information from the military, from all kinds of contractors, and looking at all the military magazines and so on. So we had compiled files and files and files on all of the weapons that were being used in Vietnam and all the other aspects of the war. And I remember getting a letter from a group out in Media, Pennsylvania. They said, well, we have a contractor here named Boeing. It's a small plant. We'd like to know what they're manufacturing. and whether it has anything to do with the Vietnam War. So with our information, we could look that up and say, well, they're manufacturing parts of 10mm cannons or something like that, and we could give them information on what was going on in that that particular plant. And I remember there was a GE plant in Philadelphia that researchers were beginning to march on and protest against, but they needed more information. So we were able to look that stuff up, given all the files that we had, and help them understand why Westinghouse and how Westinghouse was part of the Vietnam War machinery. So that was really the role we had within the wider peace movement.
I might
And
just,
how did, oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead, Arthur.
can I jump in and add one of the best examples is the Honeywell project, which Mark and David Offensohn were involved in. And what happened there is that Honeywell makes your thermostats and all kinds of home products, but they also were heavily involved in military contracts and in these cluster bombs and mines that are still blowing up legs of people in places like Vietnam. And so we worked with them. We got this huge volume called DMS, and it was a very expensive publication, over $1,000. I forget the exact amount, but it was the publication that military contractors used to find where they could get military contracts to do their work. I mean, they had to find some way to get the contracts, and all the contracts had been issued and where they went. So we got that key information, and we'd attend, as I mentioned in this. Well, anyway, we got all this key information on what the military was doing, and the Honeywell project used that for a very successful big corporate program. And because Honeywell had so many consumer products, they actually dropped at that point their Vietnam War military projects, either spun them off into another affiliate that they maybe had board members on or whatever, or they got out of it altogether. And now, of course, they're back in nuclear weapons, but a similar project could be emerging that could force them to get rid of that too, because they don't want to lose their consumer business or their bad image. They don't want to mess up their image any more than Westinghouse wanted to be told, you can be sure, when they blow up kids' legs. So
Thank you.
that was one of the key projects.
I wanted to ask you, Diana, because I remember we talked about this when I interviewed you a while back. What did the and then maybe also Arthur, you can step in too, and I'd be interested in hearing about how you all functioned as an organization. But yeah, Diana, can you talk a little bit about, you mentioned how you would get these requests and then you would do this research. What did that look like concretely? Like were you in an office? You had like sources, magazines, like library? Yeah, how would that work?
Well, we had an office within the American Friends Service Committee. And at that time, there were about 7 or 8 of us on the staff. And remember, there were no computers at that point. We didn't have computers to look stuff up. So our main sources of information were the military itself. Both the military magazines, there's Air Force magazine, there are lots of different kinds of magazines put out by the military, in which the military contractors would place ads for their particular machinery or weapons that they were producing. And also we looked at lots and lots of different newspapers and news organizations, because every once in a while somebody would put out a good information, or we would see a good article about one of the corporations. So we had voluminous files. They filled a whole wall. And then we had sources in Vietnam, because luckily the Quakers had people in Vietnam that were working to medically help the victims of the war, making artificial arms and legs and so on. But they were also close to the action. And so they would send back reports on what was happening that we could get nowhere else, because the military basically prevented anyone else from getting access to those things. So we had a lot of information that was collected over a huge range of sources. Plus we had some of this personal aspects that we could ask our staff in Vietnam, could you go look into this or that? And sometimes they could help and sometimes they couldn't. So it was a very wide, broad source and material. And again, as Arthur said, if someone would ask, what what's Honeywell doing on the war, or what's Boeing doing. We had so much information, we had to actually, break it down. Like what plant are you interested in, or are you interested in the whole company, and so on. So I got used to looking at files, looking at magazines, and writing out by typewriter what we had found and sending it off to the various peace groups. The peace groups came to us largely because our connections with the Quakers were very much involved in the peace movement at that time. They sort of got the word out that there's this group, there's this source of information that you might find helpful. I remember working a lot with the Vietnam veterans against the war. When they started coming back from Vietnam, they had a great interest in learning more about what they had been involved in and they had been opposed to at that point. So they came and helped us on a lot of things and provided the kind of background that we couldn't get from, research reports or Pentagon reports.
And in addition to all of the paper reports, we also did in-person things. We'd go to these military conventions where they would be pushing, for instance, they'd have pretty girls dancing on weapons, and they'd have free pens shaped like MX missiles, and they'd be promoting all their weapons with really unbelievable gaudy promotions. And we would attend those, and we would pick up a lot of information. For example, this was an article I wrote in the Washington Monthly in December of 1970, where we went right down to one of these military conferences where they were advertised, where they all the different contractors and Pentagon people and all were there, and they were in one of them. They were promoting after we had said we would be abolishing biological warfare. They were talking about contracts where they moved them over to Health and Human Services, because they said, we can't. We had one called "The Budget Gives the Game Away." That when President Nixon announced we were getting rid of biological warfare, we actually, none of the contracts for it disappeared. They all got shifted over to Health and Human Services, because they said we have to develop new potential biological warfare agents that the Russians might come up with, so we can develop vaccines against them. And that was the origin of the kind of work that got shifted out to overseas, including what finally ended up going to Wuhan, where they were doing gain of function research under Health and Human Services contracts, where they developed the COVID variant. So there's been a continual effort, and our research was multifaceted, both in person, interviewing some of these guys at these conferences, and doing an incredible amount of work in these books. And again, sending it out to people. There was no email. You had to fax it out, and people had to use these old mimeograph machines to make copies. It was a different era, but we were getting the word out there.
And how did all this happen? How did all this work as an organization in terms of how you function? I know you said you were sort of something of a collective. When you look back now, how would you describe your sort of organizational model and how that connected to the work you were doing?
You want to jump in first, Dan, or
go ahead, Arthur.
Well, we considered ourselves a collective, and we really were a collective. We really would hammer things out together. And what would happen is there would be, for example, when we were working on the automated air war, it would really be interesting. We sat around a room, and some people on the research side would say, "Oh, we've got to get all this detailed information on," and others would say, "No, we've got to be able to communicate this to the public in this way." And then we would merge those and come to a win-win conclusion of what actually went into the final program. So what we ended up with was a slideshow that was had a great narration and a story, but it had an inch-thick documentation of all the facts and figures that went into it. So when groups took this show out and they went and showed it, they couldn't be challenged. They could be challenged. People could ask questions or anything, but there was thick documentation documenting every single slide in it. So it was really probably one of the best documented documentaries ever made. I mean, I don't know what documentary had an inch-thick documentation of every single scene in it, but we had it. And that was because of the collective function. It wouldn't have happened if and any individual doing it would have done it one way or the other, and it wouldn't have had the impact. It was that merger into this collective that made it powerful.
I want to show you here another thing here. Does this look familiar?
Sure.
Okay, I know that you were, you did a lot of this, work on weapons specific asks that were coming from the anti-war movement. But you also put out these reports, right? Can you talk a little bit about these? Do you want to go for it, Diana? Yeah.
We would put out one a year for every fiscal 97 or 77, 78, 79, and so on. We would put out one a year. Most of the information was available in the Pentagon and by the Department of Defense. It wasn't actually public, but you could find the information of what the value of different companies' contracts were. And it was simply a matter of looking it up and then figuring out the order in which these things were put in order of magnitude. As you can see, in 1977, McDonnell Douglas was the largest defense contractor. They were making airplanes and a lot of the flyers that were going over Vietnam and dropping bombs. And so was Lockheed the second, and so was United Technologies the third. The fourth was also Boeing. So the first four were airplanes and airplane manufacturers, and they had huge numbers of war contracts. It wasn't hard to find that out, not only the number, but if you could look in the defense magazines, they would come up with ads about what they were producing for the military contractors who read the magazines. We were probably the only non-military affiliated group that subscribed to these magazines, but that's how we got a lot of the information. And every year it would change a little bit, and we'd put out a new list. And it was pretty popular. People wanted to know where the company that they were working on or that they thought about was on the list. And once they got this, then they would ask us, well, what does the $2 million in contracts buy? What are they making for $2 million? And then we could look that up in another set of documents and then get back to them on that. And so this was the beginning of fueling a number of anti-corporate projects against the Vietnam War.
One question I might have for both of you that just came to mind is, hearing you talk about this, how did you navigate as an organization? I think this is something that research groups today go through too. Like on the one hand, prioritizing work that responds to demands that are coming from the movement, right? Needs that are coming from the movement. Like the kind that you talked about, Diana, people calling you up and saying, hey, we really need this piece of research, right? That on one end. On the other end, you all are like really deep into this research. You're part of the movement. You also have a sense of like, this might be something that people don't know about that will be useful. And so we as an organization should just do this, should just put it out, right? Like how did you kind of think about your role and kind of navigate those different ways of approaching the work, responding to movement needs versus like doing kind of proactive research projects? Was that something that you had to sort of navigate?
Well,
Arthur, go ahead.
We definitely did. We definitely did both. And as I recall, there were numerous things where we worked with organizations, but where we also originated some things. One of the most powerful things we did, and one of the things that really had a huge impact was, in addition to working with local groups and organizations, we worked with people in Washington, D.C., like the Indochina Resource Center, and as well with Friends Committee on National Legislation that was working on lobbying issues and so on. And one of the most powerful things we did was working with the Indochina Resource Center. We put together an alternative budget that was looked and shaped. Every day here for their hearings, they'd have a budget where they had laid out all the things that they wanted money for. And as they were Vietnamizing the war, and as they were claiming that they were ending the war, but they were really, we put out another slideshow called the post-war war, showing that we hadn't really ended the war at all. We were just trying to hide it because the public didn't like it. We put out a document showing that when the budget showed for budget for supposedly foreign aid would say, okay, we have this program that's for let's see. Anyway, it would have a nice sounding name, but then we would reveal the actual purpose of it, like that this is actually an assassination program to kill the mayors of the local towns and so on. And we would, and congressmen would go into the markup hearings with this in their hand, with this document in their hand, and greatly cut all these programs that were funding that post-war war. And when Vietnam finally rose, and the Americans were on the roof of the embassy being evacuated, and their people being evacuated, Ambassador Graham Martin at the time said, "We didn't lose this war on the ground. It was all the fault of these groups like Indochina Resource Center who cut off our funding." So he actually credited us and them with ending the Vietnam War. I think many people were involved and many things were involved, but that was kind of the final cutoff point that actually had an impact in removing the funding that was keeping that war going.
Yeah, I remember researching part of that as a program called Food for Peace, which was supposedly bringing food in for refugees and others into Vietnam, where when we researched the contracts that they had, we realized they were bringing in weapons and other military goods for the war as well. And that was a huge scandal because they certainly didn't publicize that. So it was examples like that we actually took the wool off of the eyes of Congress and others that this program was not these programs were not what they were made out to be. And that's when Congress started to defund the war.
That's one of the questions I was actually just going to ask you. Maybe you just answered it, but is there a singular piece of work that you did with NARMIC that stands out to you as like, this is a really good example of how research, corporate power research, when it's connected to a movement, can really have an impact?
Well, I think the automated air war slideshow, remember, we were doing this on a shoestring budget, which showed the military contracts and what they were actually doing in Vietnam, and showed all sorts of aspects of pulling the wool away from the military programs. I think that was, in many ways, probably the most successful tool we had produced at that time, because you could take a slide projector into all kinds of places, into churches, into bars, into meetings, and you could show this, and they had a script and you could read the script, and you didn't have to have a lot of background information yourself because the background information was all provided. And this would create a whole group conversation many times among the people who saw it, who said, "I never thought of this before. I didn't know anything about this." So I think that was probably the best tool that we had, was using visuals, telling a story, and then providing all the background information, but making it available to all kinds of people, not just academics or scientists, but people on the street. And that, I think, may have had more impact than anything else we did.
Yeah, I certainly agree that, and I think that had it's had a very huge impact in that we were also empowering local people to become speakers about it, and to be knowledgeable about it, and they were reaching out to others, and they were reaching out to others. So it was having, and, people would write us and say, "I've been showing the slides so much, my slides are worn out. Can you send me a new set of slides?" I mean, people were really, it was one of the most heavily used resources. But also, there were, I remember when we did the budget gives the game away analysis about the chemical and biological warfare. I remember when a member of the editorial board of the New York Times wrote as a note that it was the best researched article he had seen for a long time. I mean, he highly commended the work we did and the research work that reached that. And I think there were, it also, of course, empowered each of us, and we learned how to do this research. One of the things I'm proudest of really was a post-NARMIC thing, but it was from the same era, and that is that after NARMIC, I went to work in Washington at the Center for Defense Information, and I did the research for the movie. We produced a movie, War Without Winners, with Paul Newman, but I did the research for the movie the day after, the nuclear war research, and I'd be going down to the Pentagon, looking up all the data for that, and we would get get photos and information. I remember I'd go in and anyway, a lot of stories I could tell about that. But the bottom line is, when the White House was trying to block the day after from being shown, that was that powerful film about nuclear war that was seen by 100 million Americans and eventually gave Reagan nightmares and caused him to start cutting weapons. But they were trying to block this from coming out. And one of the things they said, and there's a new documentary called Television Event that has this behind the scenes interviews that shows this, is they said, well, let's attack it on, saying it's inaccurate. Well, every single scene in it, like we would research what would be the bomb effect at ground zero, what would be the bomb effect 1 mile away and 2 miles away. And I'd be faxing this out to the crew when they were building the sets. And the White House said, well, we can't, every fact in it is true. There's nothing we can attack because the research was that solid. And that was the kind of thing that made us feel good. When the editorial board of the Times, when the ambassador that's leaving, when other people are saying our research is so good that it's having an impact on policy, and that it can't be, nobody ever was able to disprove any fact or information we ever put out. I don't remember a single case where we were challenged on it. I think that makes me feel pretty good that we did a solid job of research action. Oh, can't hear you.
Sorry, I was muted here. We're getting some really good questions, so maybe I'll ask a few more questions, and we can start to look at some of these wonderful questions that we're getting. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about. I mean, I know that especially with the Vietnam War and aftermath, like a lot of things were really focused around that. But then I know that NARMIC started to move towards doing work around nuclear weapons, and I believe sort of corporate U.S. corporate involvement in South African apartheid. Could you talk about some of the work that you did? Yeah, like a little later on around other issues within the sort of constellation of militarism and U.S. foreign policy.
Well, again, it was usually at the request from people outside who were doing work on South Africa or on nuclear weapons. They would come to us and say, we need to know more about these contractors, or can you tell us more about what's going on here? And then we would do the research and get it back out to them. So the impetus was usually from the movement, from the outside groups that were working on these issues. And then we would help provide the documentation. And of course, we were sympathetic to these movements, but they didn't have any information, especially the nuclear weapons. Some scientists came to us and said, there's a whole new generation of nuclear weapons being produced that nobody knows much about. We think you should write about it. So after a while, we thought about it, and we did. We wrote a pamphlet called New Generation of Nuclear Weapons, and there were such weapons as the Trident submarine, which had a number of nuclear bombs on it. The neutron bomb, which thankfully wasn't really produced, but would provide radiation, wouldn't kill people, but would radiate and kill buildings, and things like that. And there were, we passed out thousands and thousands of these to people that were involved in the anti-nuclear movement, because again, they were very worried about nuclear war, having seen some of these films, but who was behind it? Who was profiting off of it, and how? That's how we were able to give that information to the activists that are working on these issues, and then give them a little bit more to approach the corporations and the people most responsible for these things.
Diana, were you saying that the neutron bomb would irradiate the people, get rid of them, and save the building?
Yeah, right. That's what I meant. Mm-hmm. So that, and again, with South Africa, the same thing. There were lots of American-made products used in the South African country that were part of apartheid, and we were able to research a lot. It wasn't always nuclear weapons or weapons. Indeed, it was things like the ID cards that were being prepared for the for Africa, for Africans, that the government would use to repress people. Those were basically made by Polaroid, and some of those movements were able to use the information that we provided to give them a new entree into how do we talk about these movements and these issues with other people. It was something they could understand.
So we have some really great questions here. I have a final question I want to ask you at the end about, sort of looking back and legacies and lessons, but we should get to some of these really great questions. So Taylor Barnes is a field reporter for the military industrial complex with Inkstick Media. Taylor has a question. I'm really interested in the parochial local politics behind the military industrial complex, how a member, i.e. how a member of Congress will feel that they can't support lowering the Pentagon budget because they may, quote, lose jobs in their district. Did you ever see in your work this play out in your work? Did you ever see your work play out on the local level? Stigmatize a local employer, influence a member of Congress, labor unions, and so on. Is that something you can speak to about the sort of local granular level of all this?
Definitely we would have an impact at the local level, and there would, of course, be pushback. It was just like Eisenhower said in his military-industrial complex speech that in every state house and every single district, and they would purposely do this. By the way, we found out that they would purposely give contracts awarding to make sure that every congressional district received. Strategically placed in such a way to keep winning contracts in Congress. So part of that was not just because whoever could make this weapon best, because it didn't really matter too much. It was apportioning it to particular congressional districts. So that definitely had an impact in that area. But also, it made it challenging for people who were building the movement. But it also was empowering to have that information, and people were courageous and kept going, even though they were, of course, faced a lot of opposition in their local area, and jobs was the big push. In fact, I remember one time in the U.S.-Soviet negotiations, it came out that one of the Soviets said, "Well, why are you rigging us with all these nuclear weapons?" And they said, "Oh, don't worry about them. That's just a jobs program for the people." And I forget which particular contract they were mentioning, but they even said that to the Russians. That we were anyway. So the point is, the jobs were, definitely an excuse used to, but a bad one, because as we showed, one of these articles I had here was where we went to this convention where they were talking about this one was where they got together with the military industrial complex to talk about the environmental possible contracts, and these companies that were like 99% of the military said, well, yeah, if we can get some contracts in the environmental field, great. We always want to look for new contracting opportunities. And so there were the jobs, if they had decided to make a shift to putting all that money, for example, into building alternative energy, in which case we would be completely energy free around the world, it'd be incredible. There would have been even much more jobs created. So, and that's part, I think, the research we put out too, to show that that this wasn't a good jobs creator. In fact, it was one of the least effective jobs creators, because almost any other field you put the money into would create more jobs, because when you create a bomb, that bomb can't be reused in the community. It can't have, but you build a house, and that person, can spend any other. It's generating more income, because then that's buying the things to keep the house equipped and to go and all this. But these weapons are basically dead end investments of money.
We have another question here from Seth Horwitz asking, can you talk about the relationship between AFSC and NARMIC? How much of the human, financial, or other support came from AFSC versus outside of AFSC? And did this change over time?
Well, I would say AFSC put up the initial seed money. They have a whole division called the Peace Education Division, and we were part of that, and part of their budget was allocated to peace education. Now, that didn't create a lot of money, but it was part of the budget of the Quaker organization. But as we got more experienced and put out things like the automated air war, which cost an organizer, I think, what, $50?
$50, yeah.
Yeah, we started making money, and that would go right back into our work. Although that was certainly not the prime reason we were doing it. But once we had a number of followers, they would either give donations or they would buy some of the research in bulk, and we would get the money back for that. But primarily it was a peace organization that was doing this on the basis of peace. They had many, many donors who were interested in peace, and some of that came to NARMIC.
Yeah. And they had some wonderful people like Mike Morcino in their development department who were very favorable to the work we're doing. And of course, there's always politics with any organization. And there were people who thought, you know, this is too political or something else. But we succeeded, partly, as Diana said, because we began to build our own funding base with our work. But also just because we did have all through AFSC, there were people that loved what we were doing as well.
Thank you. There's another question about this, this question about, sort of what kind of research you do and priorities and navigating between research requests and proactive research. This is from John Lindsay Poland, and John says, it makes me wonder how NARMIC navigated moments when the movement was less active, was shifting priorities, or was just tired. I think that's something that organizers and researchers go through a lot. You go through these big upswings and then downswings and energy and movement moments. Do you recall times where you all had to maybe have like internal discussions about what do we do now?
Well, there always seemed to be opportunities out there, and we just had to decide which of the many opportunities we wanted to take up first, and they all fit our criteria of being essential parts of the Vietnam machine. So I don't think we had a problem with that. And as movements waxed and wanes, they would ask for information and we would give it, and that was probably the most important part that we could do. Sometimes we would go and talk with these organizations and help explain to them how they might organize it or how that might fit into their own priorities. But mostly we were a research arm, and they would come to us if they had trouble staying alive or staying appropriate. Sometimes they would reach out to new constituents. I remember when the peace movement started to reach out to the Vietnam vets. That added a huge amount of interest and energy to the peace movement, because they were certainly very energetic about their opposition to the war. And they would come into our office and say, I flew a B-12 bomber and I want to know who made that, and so on. So we've had a lot of different kinds of sources of energy that would wax and wane. But we had an untappable, totally, I'm trying to find the words, a good source of information for just about anything. So anytime a group was sort of floundering around and they would come up with ideas, we would sometimes say, well, we can help you on this one and that one. And then if they could find an organizing book, they would usually use it. A lot of that went into going to stockholders meetings and other kinds of, and congressional hearings and so on, and using that information in ways that they might not have originally thought they would be willing to or able to.
Yeah, and I'm glad Diana brought up working with the Vietnam veterans against the war. I got the opportunity to testify at the Winter Soldier investigation, which Jane Fonda and Tom Hayden helped put together, and it was all with the Vietnam veterans coming back and telling about all the horrific things that had happened, like the My Lai massacre and other things. But what we testified about was the impact of Agent Orange and the total destruction of the ecosystems in Laos and from the along what they call the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but it was just devastating these little countries, these small countries, and the impact of that poisoning the water systems. People still today, veterans and others, are dying from the impact of the and from the Agent Orange that was being rained down on everybody, and the birth defects out of that. So we got to testify about things like that. So working with Vietnam veterans against the war was a very key part of the movement. I never remember a dull moment. I never remember saying, "What do we do next?" That never happened.
That's right.
And when you look back now, after all these years on NARMIC, what do you feel like you're most proud of?
Well, frankly, I'm most proud of helping keep the largest anti-war movement in American history alive and well, and able to stop a war. We certainly never imagined that we would do that, but we did, and with the help of all of the peace movement people. And so, to me, it's testimony to the power of the people when they get organized, get the amount of information that they need, and then confront the people who hold the power. To me, that was crucial, and I haven't seen really another movement like that before or since.
Yeah, I certainly agree. I think that definitely we had that verification from the ambassador himself that we helped stop the Vietnam War, and I think it was the whole movement that we were feeding that did that. I mean, the pride is in the whole movement, because it's not we were just a resource, but we were a resource that helped provide pivotal key information that helped empower a huge movement and a huge number of people, and we helped give them a way to express themselves. Even though we had a tape that could go with the automated air war, we frequently encouraged people, if they could, to not use the tape and to speak themselves, because they became speakers. They became people answered questions. It was kind of a more interactive media. I mean, we're now all deluged with so many media sources like YouTube and everything you didn't have back then. But people had to they could play the slides tape, but empowering other people. I think that was really the thing I'm most proud of, and also, as we mentioned, the impact we had on policy in both the chemical and biological warfare area, but certainly in the Vietnam War, and on really awakening people's eyes, and being maybe one of the few groups that really made their whole focus on exactly what President Eisenhower called on the whole country to do, to be wary of the military-industrial complex, and that it was going to, rob our economy. It was going to. He said, what could be if we continue on this dread path? The worst to be expected is nuclear war. The best to be expected would be a life of continual. He went on to talk about poverty and devastation of the economy and all the things that have happened. And I think, we needed to heed that. And we were a group heeding that warning that was so powerful and important for our world.
Mm-hmm.
And there's been a couple of questions that have sort of alluded to this in one way or another, but it's also a question I wanted to ask. For researchers today, movement researchers, and also for organizers, maybe people who aren't researchers but could use research. When you look back, what do you feel are the most important lessons from the experience of NARMIC that you think it's important for people in the movement today and in the future to be aware of?
Well, for me, one thing is the fact that you don't have to be a so-called expert to understand these things and to write about them and research them. You can have all the experts you want, but they won't always see the bigger picture of how this fits into the politics of a movement, of a country. And it's not that hard. You just have to have a few dedicated people and create access to the information that you need, and maybe some initial funding, but even that can be on a volunteer basis. We trained a group of students at Oberlin College to do some research on behalf of a congresswoman on some issues. They had no idea what they were doing, but once they found the information in original sources, they were able to put together a report for the local congresswoman that was very useful. So you don't have to be an expert. You do have to be aware of how things are hidden, and it's not impossible. Arthur, What do you think?
Well, no, I fully agree with you. I think that many people accept the pablum that's fed out to them, and to learn to see behind the veil, to learn to see the guy pulling the strings, the wizard, like the Wizard of Oz, pulling the strings of what looks like this powerful, mighty, impossible to beat giant that really is just people, and that if you begin to not believe that myth and to begin to realize that we the people are the ones with the power, you can jump into it. None of us were trained as researchers. Well, I don't think so. I think, but the best thing we did was to combine the people. You know, some people are just really good at detail and researching, you know, lines and figures and can spend hours and hours buried in it. And other people are good at communicating. And I think the bridge of bringing all that together so that we both do the research and we communicate, we reach beyond academia. So people aren't lost. I mean, our slideshows were just very plain talk. You know, we researchers would say something in some complex way, and then we'd be able to translate it into just very simple, plain language that spoke it. And I think that was part of the power, that we have to be able to, as Diana said, reach beyond academics and research people and put it together. And yet there's other people who just shout slogans and don't know what they're doing and don't have facts and figures. Neither side alone is going to be very powerful. But when you put it together so that you really are empowering it, so you're really the voice that's speaking out is clear and understandable by people, but it also has the power of facts and documentation. I think that's what gave it the power, and that's, I think, something we're proud of.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. We have just a few more minutes here, and someone just posted an interesting question saying, Miss Roose's last comment was interesting. What are some of the ways that things are quote unquote hidden? And maybe that's an interesting question to end with too. Like when, you know, in doing this research, you know, I mean, with LittleSis, and one thing I've always found is that there's so much that is actually out there in plain sight. Like if you just know where to look, right? And
hidden in plain sight, right? Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it's not, you know, you do have to know where to look. You know, it's not sort of intuitive knowledge that, like, of what a proxy statement is or what a annual report is for a company. But once you do know, it's right there. A lot of it's right there if you can just put it together, right? I mean, like, how do you think about that in terms of doing research and what's hidden and what's there? And that might be encouraging for researchers.
Well, you know, we're fed a lot of pablum, and I think you just have to have your eyes open and not believe the mainstream media and the things that are there, and then dig in deeper and really go back to source. As Diana said, look at the sources. Go back to the original sources. I remember when I was in high school, I had one teacher that taught history as sort of like memorizing series of wars, and it was incredibly boring. And then we had another teacher who actually went back to the original sources, and we read the original material. And for instance, on slavery, we read the people who were pro-slavery who said the North is doing even far worse with the factories and the ways they're exploiting people. And you know, we found out, well, there really are people on both sides with thoughts and issues. And you know, going back to original sources in any field, you can discover so much more than the really false stories that were fed by media, by most of the textbooks and other things. So even back in school, I remember, you know, not believing the textbooks and trying to, at least this one teacher helped us learn to do that, to go look back at the original source. And it's interesting, whether you agree with it or not, you find out that history is a dynamic. It's not just this, you know, then A, then B, then C. Things happen in an interactive, dynamic way, and we can feed into that, and we help feed into the new realities and the new stories that help shift people's lives.
And I think also researchers, at least from academia, which I come from also, have a habit of not thinking about all of the implications of what they're doing. Looking at the pieces that comprise a neutron bomb, for example, and looking and finding out how to make a more powerful bomb. I remember talking to people who had worked on the H-bomb including Edward Teller, and they were really preoccupied with how do we make this work, and not so much on what is the effect, aside from how big the blast will be. What is the effect on people and countries and on the world of what we're doing? And once they start to think about that in a creative way, then I think people start to think about their work and the research differently.
Thank you very much. We are at the hour here, so I just wanted to just open it up to see if there's anything that we haven't talked about that you wanted to say. And after that, we can say our goodbyes.
Well, I would just add that, I mean, Diana's continuing powerful work. I am. You see, I'm sitting here by my People Powered Planet podcast and our film, The World is My Country. You know, I continue my whole life. I've continued the path that NARMIC helped get me started on, and that is making powerful films and resources that can help turn the world from the path of war to a path of peace, and can do so in a solid way. So I would just encourage people to go ahead and look at the worldismycountry.com, futurewaves.org. I know Diana must have some. Well, of course, the AFSC. I think it's afsc.org/ investigate or research. What is that URL for the AFSC?
I'm not sure, but there is a new research team at American Friends Service Committee that was modeled to some extent on NARMIC, and they're working on issues in the Middle East, issues about Native Americans, and again, looking at the power structure underneath and what's underneath the news. So it's not impossible to do that. You just have to have the goal and get a few people together to start, and that will bring in other people as well.
Thank you. Well, I guess with that, we want to say again how grateful we are for you for joining us. This was a really wonderful discussion. Again, for people who want to learn more about NARMIC, there's some links in the chat. And you can, of course, do an online search and you'll find a lot about NARMIC. Not enough, but you'll find enough to learn about NARMIC. Yeah, and I guess also, if you're feeling so inclined, please feel free to again follow LittleSis on social media or newsletters. We're always, again, see ourselves in the tradition of groups like NARMIC putting out reports and doing helpful research for the movement and so on. And if you feel so inclined, feel free to make a donation to this small and plucky nonprofit. That's in the chat as well. But yeah, with that, we will say goodbye. And yeah, thank you again, Diana and Arthur. This has really been a pleasure.
And I put a few links in there if people want to follow up in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek. Wonderful.
Thanks, Derek.
Interviews.
I remember when I first heard from Derek about LittleSis and the action research you were doing. Action research is also another name for what we do. You might find things on that, but I was thinking, I was so glad to hear that somebody was picking up on this kind of research and doing